The Victorian mansion loomed before us, its weathered facade a stark testament to decades of history I knew nothing about. As Richard guided me up the creaking steps of what would become our new home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The real estate agent had practically given it away, muttering about eager sellers and quick closings while avoiding my eyes. "Welcome home, Mrs. Katie Morrison," Richard beamed, sweeping me into his arms as we crossed the threshold. His enthusiasm felt genuine, yet there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. Maybe uncertainty. Or was it guilt? I pushed the thought aside. After all, this was supposed to be our fresh start. My writing career was finally taking off, with my first novel about to hit the shelves, and Richard's investment firm had promoted him to partner. Everything was perfect. Too perfect, perhaps. Mrs. Henderson from next door brought over a casserole that evening, her lined face creasing with concern as she took in our surroundings. "Oh, you're in the old Morrison place," she said, then stopped abruptly, glancing at Richard with an odd expression. "Morrison?" I asked. "That's quite a coincidence, sharing the same last name as the previous owners." Richard laughed, but it sounded forced. "Common name, darling. Now, Mrs. Henderson, would you like some coffee?" The elderly woman declined, backing away almost too quickly. "No, no. I should get home before dark. The nights here can be. Well, welcome to the neighborhood." As I unpacked our belongings over the next few days, the house seemed to resist our presence. Doors would stick unexpectedly, floorboards would creak without anyone walking on them, and the electricity flickered despite the new wiring Richard had insisted on installing. But it was the master bedroom that bothered me most, particularly the walk-in closet that Richard had promptly claimed for himself, installing a new lock to protect his expensive suits. I tried to focus on setting up my writing studio in the sunny room overlooking the garden, but my attention kept drifting to the whispered conversations I'd catch snippets of when neighbors passed by. They'd go silent the moment they spotted me, offering tight smiles and hurried waves. One afternoon, while Richard was at work, I decided to introduce myself to the other neighbors. Most weren't home, but Mr. Jenkins, retired history teacher 3 doors down, invited me in for tea. His hands trembled slightly as he poured. "You know," he said carefully, "this neighborhood holds onto its secrets like a miser with his gold. Some things are better left buried in the past." "What do you mean?" I asked, but he changed the subject, talking about property values and local schools instead. That night, as Richard and I prepared for bed, I noticed him checking his phone more frequently than usual. When I walked into our bathroom, I caught him quickly ending a call. "Work never stops," he said with that winning smile that had first drawn me to him 2 years ago. But now it seemed different, strained around the edges. As I lay in bed that night, listening to Richard's steady breathing beside me, a sudden draft sent chills down my spine. The window was closed, yet the curtains swayed gently, as if stirred by an unseen presence. Then I heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from inside the walls. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, but Richard was already asleep. Or was he pretending? I slipped out of bed and followed the sound to his locked closet. Pressing my ear against the door, I heard nothing but the pounding of my own heart. As I turned to leave, my foot caught on a loose floorboard. Bending down to press it back in place, I noticed something wedged in the gap, the corner of what looked like an envelope, yellowed with age. I glanced at Richard's sleeping form before carefully working the envelope free. Inside was a photograph, its edges worn and creased. My hands began to shake as I made out the image in the dim light. It showed a younger Richard, standing in front of this very house, his arm around a woman who wasn't me. On the back, written in faded ink, was a simple message: "To my darling husband Richard, may our love fill every room of our new home. Forever yours, Sarah Morrison." The date was from 5 years ago. I spent the rest of the night sitting in my writing studio, staring at the photograph until sunrise painted the walls in shades of accusation. Sarah Morrison. The name echoed in my mind like a tolling bell. My fingers traced the edge of the photograph, noting how happy they looked together, Richard's smile reaching his eyes in a way I rarely saw nowadays. When Richard's alarm went off at 6, I heard him moving around upstairs. My hands trembled as I tucked the photograph into my robe pocket. I had rehearsed the confrontation a dozen times in my head, but when he appeared in the doorway of my studio, briefcase in hand, my carefully prepared speech evaporated. "You're up early," he said, adjusting his tie. "Working on the new book. Who is Sarah Morrison?" The words burst out before I could stop them. The change in his expression was subtle but unmistakable, a tightening around the eyes, a slight clench of his jaw. Then, just as quickly, his face smoothed into confusion. "I don't know who that is. Where did you hear that name?" I pulled out the photograph. "Stop lying, Richard. I found this last night." He took the photograph, his fingers whitening around the edges. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stared at the image as if willing it to disappear. Finally, he sank into my reading chair, suddenly looking older than his 42 years. "It's not what you think," he began, but I cut him off. "What I think is that you've been lying to me since the day we met. You were married before. You lived in this house with her. And now she's gone, and you've brought me here like some sick replacement. What happened to her, Richard?" "She left me," he said, his voice flat. "4 years ago. We were having problems, and one day I came home from work, and she was gone. Took nothing but her passport and some cash. I filed a missing persons report, but the police found evidence she'd bought a ticket to Europe. They closed the case. And you never thought to mention any of this to me? In 2 years of marriage, it never came up that you owned this house before? That you were married?" He leaned forward, reaching for my hand, but I stepped back. "Katie, please." I was ashamed. The divorce was never finalized because we couldn't locate her. I wanted to tell you, but I was afraid of losing you. When this house came back on the market, I thought it was a sign. A chance to make new memories, better ones. Something in his explanation felt off, like a puzzle piece forced into the wrong spot. "Mrs. Henderson recognized you. The whole neighborhood knows something, and they're afraid to talk about it. What really happened, Richard?" His phone buzzed, and he glanced at it with obvious relief. "I have to get to work. We'll talk about this tonight, I promise. I'll tell you everything." But as he stood to leave, a piece of paper fluttered from his pocket, an old shopping list in feminine handwriting I didn't recognize. The items were ordinary enough: cleaning supplies, trash bags, bleach. But it was the last item that made my blood run cold: limestone, lots of it. After he left, I sat at my computer, fingers hovering over the keyboard. A simple search would tell me what I needed to know about Sarah Morrison, but did I really want to know? The cursor blinked accusingly as I typed her name. The first result was from a local newspaper archive: "Local woman missing, husband questions disappearance." The article was brief, mentioning that Sarah Morrison, 34, had last been seen arguing with someone in their front yard. The police had found no signs of forced entry or struggle, but neighbors reported hearing shouting late that night. I was so engrossed in reading that I almost missed the sound of footsteps in the hall, but I was alone in the house. When I turned around, there was nothing there except a faint trace of perfume I'd never worn and what looked like wet footprints leading to Richard's locked closet. The footprints vanished before my eyes, but they left behind something solid: a small key, tarnished with age, lying precisely where the last footprint had been. I picked it up with trembling fingers, recognizing the intricate Victorian design that matched the house's original fixtures. I looked at Richard's closet door, then at the key in my hand. The choice I made next would change everything, but then again, maybe everything had already changed the moment I found that photograph. The key slid into the lock with the quiet certainty of fate. The lock clicked open with an almost musical sound. For a moment, I stood frozen, hand on the doorknob, heart thundering in my chest. The air felt thick with anticipation, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Inside, the closet looked deceptively normal at first: pressed suits, polished shoes, neat rows of ties. But as I pushed deeper into the space, the organized facade gave way to chaos. Behind Richard's designer clothes, the back wall showed signs of recent construction. The drywall was slightly newer, the paint a shade lighter than the rest of the house. Something caught my eye, a corner of paper sticking out from behind a loose baseboard. When I pulled it free, a cascade of letters spilled out, along with a small leather-bound diary. The pages were filled with Sarah's increasingly frantic handwriting. March 15th, Richard's behavior is becoming erratic. The business losses are worse than he admitted. When I confronted him about the missing money from our joint account, he threw his phone through the window. I'm scared. April 2nd, found strange receipts in his office. Industrial cleaning supplies, power tools. When I asked, he said they were for home renovation projects, but something feels wrong. The basement door is always locked now. April 10th, I overheard him on the phone talking about offshore accounts. The names he mentioned. I did some research. These are dangerous people. I have to get proof before I go to the authorities. The final entry chilled me to the bone. April 15th, if you're reading this, I've hidden copies of everything in the old well behind Mrs. Henderson's property. Richard knows I know. I can see it in his eyes. Last night he asked me to sign papers transferring our assets. When I refused, The entry ended abruptly, a dark smear across the page. My hands shaking, I dug deeper into the pile of papers. Bank statements showed massive transfers to numbered accounts. Correspondence with names I recognized from recent financial scandals. Richard hadn't just been hiding a previous marriage, he'd been running a sophisticated money laundering operation. A creak behind me made me whirl around. Mrs. Henderson stood in the doorway, her usual nervousness replaced by grim determination. I've been waiting for someone to find those, she said quietly. Sarah showed them to me the night she disappeared. I was too much of a coward to go to the police then. The things Richard threatened to do to my grandchildren. She pulled a USB drive from her pocket. Sarah gave me this for safekeeping. Said if anything happened to her, I should pass it on to someone who could expose the truth. I've been watching you, Katie. You're a writer. You know how to tell stories that need to be told. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text from Richard, coming home early. We need to talk about Sarah. Don't do anything rash. Mrs. Henderson's face went pale. He knows. Someone must have seen me come in. You need to leave. Now. I can't just dash. Listen to me, she gripped my arm with surprising strength. Sarah tried to gather evidence too. The night she disappeared, I heard screaming from your basement. Richard reported her missing the next day, but before the police arrived, I saw him making trips to the hardware store. Coming back with lime and concrete. Don't you understand? The basement floor is newer than the rest. A car door slammed outside. Through the window, I saw Richard's Mercedes in the driveway. The well, Mrs. Henderson whispered urgently. Behind my house. Sarah's proof is there. But you have to survive long enough to find it. She pressed the USB drive into my hand. Take the back stairs. I'll stall him. As if to punctuate her words, the front door opened downstairs. Richard's footsteps echoed through the house, deliberately slow, like a predator scenting prey. Katie, his voice floated up, honeyed with menace. We need to talk about what you've been discovering. I can explain everything. Mrs. Henderson pushed me toward the back staircase. Run, she mouthed silently. I clutched Sarah's diary in the USB drive, my writer's mind already composing the story even as my survival instinct screamed at me to flee. But one thought burned brighter than fear: Sarah deserved justice. And I was going to make sure she got it. Richard's footsteps started up the main staircase. The back staircase groaned under my feet as I descended, every sound magnified in the terrible silence. Richard's footsteps had stopped, he was listening, hunting. I could almost feel his presence above, like a storm about to break. "Mrs. Henderson," his voice carried through the house, falsely pleasant. "What an unexpected surprise. Having a chat with my wife, were you?" "Just bringing over some banana bread," Mrs. Henderson replied, her wavering voice buying me precious seconds. "You know how I stress bake." I reached the bottom of the stairs, clutching Sarah's diary and the USB drive. The back door was 10 feet away. Freedom. Then my phone buzzed loudly in my pocket. "Katie?" Richard called out. "I heard that. Come upstairs, darling. Whatever you think you know, you're jumping to conclusions. Let me explain." His footsteps resumed, faster now. I darted for the door, but the handle wouldn't turn. Locked. The key would be on my keyring, upstairs in my studio. "Your father's investments," Richard continued, his voice closer. "Your publishing advance. All that money you thought was safely growing. It's gone through the same channels as the others. You're already involved, Katie. You can't expose this without exposing yourself." My blood ran cold. He'd used me, made me complicit. No wonder he'd encouraged me to trust him with all my finances. I glanced at the basement door, the one Sarah had mentioned in her diary. The one Richard always kept locked. A creak overhead. He was coming down. I did the only thing I could think of: I yanked open the coat closet under the stairs and slipped inside, pulling the door shut just as Richard reached the bottom step. Through the slats, I watched his feet pass by, expensive leather shoes moving with deliberate precision. "Katie." His voice had dropped the pretense of warmth. "Don't make this difficult. Think about your career. Your family. There are people counting on this money, dangerous people. They won't appreciate anyone threatening their investments." He moved toward the back door, checking it. I pressed deeper into the closet, disturbing something that swung on a hanger behind me. I reached back to steady it and felt smooth, cold plastic. A garment bag. "I did try to protect you," Richard continued, moving back toward the stairs. "Kept you away from the ugly truth. Just like I tried to protect Sarah. But she wouldn't listen either." My fingers found the zipper of the garment bag. Inside was a woman's dress, still fresh with the scent of department store perfume. The size matched my measurements exactly. A receipt fluttered to the floor, dated 3 months before I'd met Richard. He'd planned this. All of it. Finding me, marrying me, bringing me here. I was never a coincidence, I was a replacement, carefully selected and groomed. A sound from upstairs made Richard turn. Mrs. Henderson must have tried to make a move. His footsteps retreated up the stairs, and I seized my chance. Bursting from the closet, I ran for the basement door. The handle turned. It wasn't locked. Richard had grown careless, confident in his control. I slipped inside and pulled the door shut behind me, feeling for a light switch. Fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, revealing steep stairs descending into darkness. "Katie." Richard's shout from above was followed by running footsteps. "Don't go down there." But I was already descending, driven by a desperate need to know the truth. The basement air grew colder with each step. At the bottom, the recently poured concrete floor stretched out before me, perfectly smooth except for one corner where the edge had chipped away. Something pale gleamed in the exposed earth beneath. Richard's footsteps thundered down the stairs behind me. I spun around to face him, backing toward that broken corner. His face was transformed by rage and something else, a terrible kind of triumph. You just had to know, didn't you? He snarled. Had to play detective. Just like her. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a gleaming object. You know what the trouble with writers is? They never know when to end the story. The gun in Richard's hand caught the fluorescent light as he descended the final steps. I clutched Sarah's diary tighter, my back pressed against the rough basement wall. My mind raced through possibilities. The stairs were blocked, no windows down here, the only other door led to a root cellar that probably hadn't been opened in decades. You know what's fascinating about financial crimes, Katie? Richard's voice was conversational, as if we were discussing plot points for one of my novels. Everyone thinks they're victimless. Just numbers on a screen. But the real profit comes from what happens to people who threaten to expose those numbers. Like Sarah? I forced myself to meet his eyes. How many others are buried down here, Richard? He smiled, an expression I'd once found charming but now saw as the mask it truly was. Sarah was special. My first real test. The others were just business, people who asked too many questions about certain investments. But Sarah? He gestured at the chipped concrete with his gun. She's the foundation of everything. Literally. A noise upstairs made him glance back momentarily. I seized the chance to edge toward the root cellar door. The police will find out eventually. Mrs. Henderson dash. Mrs. Henderson won't be a problem much longer, he cut in. I've already called in some associates to handle that loose end. They're probably having a chat with her right now. My hand found the root cellar's handle behind me. To my shock, it turned. You really think you can kill everyone who threatens your operation? Kill everyone? He laughed. Katie, you still don't understand. Death is messy, draws attention. Much better to make people complicit. Why do you think I married you? A struggling writer with a gift for storytelling and a desperate need for financial security. The perfect face for some of our trickier investment ventures. The pieces clicked together. The publishing contract. My sudden success. That was you. Money opens every door. Your talent just made it believable. We could have been amazing together, Katie. Still could be. He took a step closer. Think about it, you've already handled laundered money. You're involved. But help me clean this up, and you'll never have to worry about money again. Your next book could be a bestseller. Every book could be a bestseller. The root cellar door creaked slightly as I leaned against it. Richard's eyes narrowed at the sound. Step away from there, Katie. What's in here, Richard? More foundations. His face hardened. Last chance. Come here and give me Sarah's diary. We'll get rid of it together. Start fresh. In that moment, I saw our whole relationship with terrible clarity, every perfect coincidence, every too-good-to-be-true opportunity, all orchestrated by the monster before me. I thought of Sarah, probably standing in this same spot, facing the same choice. Fresh start. I spat the words. Like Sarah's fresh start in Europe. Tell me, did you already have me picked out when you killed her? Was the dress upstairs fitted before or after she disappeared? The gun steadied, pointing at my chest. You're making a mistake. No, I said, my fingers tightening on the root cellar's handle. I made a mistake the day I married you. I yanked the door open and threw myself sideways just as the gun roared. Pain blazed across my arm as the bullet grazed me. I crashed through the doorway into darkness as Richard's second shot splintered wood where I'd been standing. Behind me, Richard cursed as he pursued. But I had the advantage now, I'd seen what he hadn't. The roots breaking through the old cellar walls. The worn steps leading to a storm drain. Sarah's diary had mentioned the house's original plans. This wasn't just a cellar, it was an escape tunnel from Prohibition days. Richard's footsteps echoed behind me as I plunged deeper into the darkness. But I wasn't running away. Not really. With every step, I was running toward something, toward the well behind Mrs. Henderson's house. Toward Sarah's hidden evidence. Toward justice. I just had to survive long enough to reach it. Blood trickled down my arm as I felt my way through the tunnel. Richard's frustrated shouts grew more distant, he'd lost me in the darkness. But I could hear him on his phone, voice urgent, "She's in the tunnels. Get everyone here. Now." I pulled out my own phone, its screen casting weak light on the earthen walls. One bar of signal. Enough to send a single message, or make one vital call. Behind me, more voices joined Richard's. His associates had arrived. My fingers trembled as I dialed 911, my voice barely a whisper in the darkness. "This is Katie Morrison. I'm at 1879, Sycamore Drive. My husband Richard Morrison has a gun. There's a body in the basement, Sarah Morrison. I'm in the underground tunnels connecting to the old well behind the Henderson property. He's coming after me. Please hurry." The tunnel curved ahead, decades of dirt and debris making every step treacherous. My arm throbbed where the bullet had grazed me, blood seeping through my sleeve. Behind me, flashlight beams danced on the walls as Richard's people spread through the tunnel system. "She's heading for the well." Richard's voice echoed. "Cut her off above ground." I reached a junction where the tunnel split. Left or right? Sarah's diary had mentioned the well, but not how to reach it. Making a split-second decision, I went left, using my phone's light sparingly to conserve battery. The voices grew closer. I ducked into an alcove, holding my breath as footsteps passed. Through a crack in the tunnel wall, I could see flashlights sweeping the main passage. "Boss wants her alive," a gruff voice said. "She's got evidence on her phone. Some kind of drive too." "What about the old lady next door?" "Handled. Made it look like a break-in gone wrong. Mrs. Henderson." I pressed my hand against my mouth to stifle a sob. "She died trying to help me, trying to finally bring Sarah justice. Her death wouldn't be in vain." I waited until the footsteps faded, then continued forward. The tunnel widened, and I could feel a slight breeze. I had to be getting close to the well. My phone buzzed silently, a text from an unknown number. "This is Detective Martinez. We're surrounding the house. Stay hidden. Help is coming." A crash echoed through the tunnel behind me, followed by cursing. They were getting frustrated, careless. Good. The tunnel ended abruptly at a brick wall, but I could see moonlight filtering through cracks above. The well. I had to be directly beneath it. Feeling along the wall, my hands found iron rungs embedded in the brick, an old maintenance ladder. I started climbing just as a flashlight beam caught me. There. A gunshot rang out, chips of brick spraying my face. I scrambled upward as more shots followed. Through the gap above, I could see stars, and the well's metal grate cover. Richard's voice came from directly below. "Stop right there, Katie. It's over." I looked down. He stood at the base of the ladder, gun aimed upward, his face twisted with rage in the flashlight beam. "You know what happens now," he said. "Even if you get out, my people are up there. You've got nowhere to go. Come down, give me the evidence, and maybe we can still work something out. Like you worked things out with Sarah." His laugh echoed off the walls. "Sarah made her choice. Just like you're making yours." I reached the top of the ladder, my injured arm screaming in protest as I pushed against the grate. It didn't budge. "Last chance, Katie. The hard way gets very messy." A flashlight beam from above suddenly illuminated the grate. A voice called down, "Mrs. Morrison. Detective Martinez. We're going to lift the grate." Stay still. Richard's curse was drowned out by the screech of metal as the grate was pulled away. Hands reached down to help me up. FBI. Drop your weapons. The night air exploded with shouts and gunfire. I was pulled clear of the well as tactical teams swarmed the area. Through the chaos, I saw Richard trying to flee back into the tunnel, only to find more agents emerging from the house end. Katie Morrison. A female detective approached me as paramedics wrapped my arm. We'll need your statement, but first, there's someone who wants to talk to you. She led me to an unmarked car. In the back seat sat a woman I recognized from the photograph, older, hair shorter and grayed, but unmistakably Sarah Morrison. Very much alive. Witness protection, she explained, seeing my shock. I managed to get evidence to the FBI before Richard's people caught up to me. They faked my death while they built a case, but we didn't have enough to bring down the whole organization. Not until you found my diary and the USB drive. Mrs. Henderson. Sarah's face fell. I heard. She was my friend. Helped me escape that night. Richard will pay for what he did to her. 6 months later. I sat in the courtroom as the jury foreman read the verdict. Richard and 23 co-conspirators, guilty on all counts. The evidence Sarah and I had provided had exposed one of the largest money laundering operations in the state's history. My third novel, The House of Shadows, hit the bestseller list, this time without any criminal assistance. The profits went to a foundation supporting victims of financial fraud, managed by Sarah. The old house on Sycamore Drive was sold, its dark secrets finally laid to rest. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I think about the women who lived there, Sarah, who fought back and survived, Mrs. Henderson, who died helping us find justice, and me, the replacement wife who brought it all crashing down. They say every house has its stories. Some are just written in blood and buried in concrete, waiting for someone brave enough, or foolish enough, to dig them up.